More than 27,000 people now have been killed and 66,000 wounded by Israel's offensive in the Gaza Strip. The Hamas-controlled territory's health ministry bringing out these statistics this Thursday. South Africa's foreign minister is accusing Israel of ignoring last week's ruling by the United Nations top court, which ordered Israel to do all it can to prevent deaths in Gaza. Israel's defense minister, Yoav Gallant, says his forces have killed 10,000 Gaza fighters. This Thursday, the bombardment continues. Well, Hamas has confirmed it's received the Paris peace proposals and that it's considering them. Along with this, the plight of 130 or so hostages taken by Hamas on October the 7th remains in the balance. Let's bring in Jasmine El-Gamal, a political analyst and former advisor at the US Department of Defense, for some context and analysis on this. Jasmine, thanks for being with us here on France 24. Do you feel that the end of the ordeal for the hostages is any nearer this evening?
Thank you for having me, Mark. I would hope so. I mean, there's reason to be cautiously optimistic here that the deal is going to be eventually hammered out. As you've reported and as you've seen, there have been frantic diplomatic efforts, frantic negotiations to try to get the two parties to some kind of an agreement over some parameters that would be acceptable to both of them. So you started out basically with Hamas and the Israelis, led by Prime Minister Netanyahu, being extremely far apart, with Hamas saying that they won't consider any kind of a deal without a full and immediate ceasefire and a lasting one, and the withdrawal of all Israeli soldiers from the Gaza Strip. And of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu was saying, absolutely not. That's a red line. There's going to be no full permanent ceasefire. So that's where they started. And what you've seen in these negotiations is the Qataris, the Egyptians, and the Americans trying as hard as they can to bring those two maximalist positions closer together.
Is Netanyahu the real obstacle, or is it just as bad on both sides?
You have to assume that both sides are pretty reluctant to engage in or to accept a deal that would not allow them to save face, and in Prime Minister Netanyahu's case, to not allow for a government walkout. As you know, there are more extremist elements of the Israeli government that are threatening to walk out if what they see in this deal and how it's presented to them is not to their liking. So he has to balance several different things. He has to balance, on one hand, the hostage families and the pressure that he's been facing from them to get a deal done to release their families. You have the pressure from Ben Gvir and the more extremist elements of the Israeli government saying we're going to walk out if we don't like this deal. Then you obviously have pressure from the Americans as well, for whom the release of the hostages and the entrance of more humanitarian assistance are two big priorities for them. So he's really having to balance out a lot of different elements here as he tries to figure out what elements of a deal and what parameters he can be willing to accept and to sign up for.
It is difficult finding a way ahead, finding a solution. One wonders if the United States could do more in terms of perhaps saying to Israel, in terms of an ultimatum, if you don't make these compromises, then we'll stop giving you the aid that we give you.
Right. So they're definitely not going to do that, at least not publicly. In fact, you've probably seen more supportive statements from the Americans. The national security spokesperson, John Kirby, was just saying, we continue to support Israel. We continue to believe in Israel's right to eliminate Hamas. We agree with Israel that the threat from Hamas has not yet been defeated. So you're really seeing a lot of these supportive statements officially from the Americans, I suspect, to give them a bit more room to push the Israelis privately. And there have also been leaks from the American administration to the press, basically talking about how the U.S. is now considering recognizing a Palestinian state and other such things, and how they're frustrated with the Israelis. So there's a lot going on here. You have the public posture of the Americans. You have what you can imagine are very tough conversations behind the scenes with the Israelis. And then you have these leaks that are happening to try to put some pressure on certain elements of the Israeli government, Prime Minister Netanyahu and other ministers who have so far been really reluctant to get to a deal.
Finally, Jasmine, South Africa brought Israel before the International Court of Justice last week on a charge of genocide. That court asked Israel to do all it can to avoid killing civilians in the Gaza Strip, but the bombardment continues. Doesn't this really sum up the whole crux of the matter?
That's right. And I'm glad you brought that up, Mark. I mean, the ICJ decision obviously was a very significant one, and it did rule that that South Africa's claim that Israel was committing genocide was a plausible one. And so it ruled for these provisionary measures and said that Israel had to do everything in its power to prevent further harm to people in the Gaza Strip. The very next day, Israel accused 12 members of UNRWA, the organization that provides most of the life-saving assistance and education to the Palestinians, of having ties to Hamas. And that was followed by the suspension or the announcement of the US, the UK, Canada, and other Western countries suspending aid to UNRWA. So not exactly what people had in mind or were expecting after the ICJ decision, certainly.
Jasmine El-Gamal, we need to leave it there, but thank you very much for giving us that analysis, which, of course, we're all listening to very intently and waiting for developments coming from the Middle East. But as yet, no sign of anything really moving on the idea of moving towards a truce. Jasmine, thank you for being with us here in France 24. We appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.